The vote passed at 14:07 station time. I know the exact minute because I was watching the council's clock when it happened. A small golden disc mounted above the speaker's podium, its hands moving with the slow, indifferent certainty of something that had been keeping time since before humanity reached the stars. I wrote the minute in my notebook. Then I wrote the result. Then I closed the notebook and put it inside my jacket, and I sat very still while the chamber erupted around me. They were cheering, not politely, not the restrained, diplomatic applause that usually followed procedural votes. The delegates of the Galactic Council were standing at their posts, some of them vocalizing in ways that their translator chips converted to sounds resembling laughter, others reaching across the aisles to touch one another in gestures of congratulation. The Velhari admiral who had introduced the motion, a tall, gray-scaled creature named Vasaroth, whose species had been dominant in this region of space for 600 years, was standing at the central podium with something very close to triumph on her face. I had been watching her for 3 days. I knew what that expression meant. She believed she had just done something historic. She had. She just did not understand what kind of history it was. The resolution was called 7 Omega. The council had given it a dramatic name, which told me more about their confidence than anything they had said in 3 days of debate. When you name something 7 Omega, you believe it is final. You believe there is nothing left to come after it. The text of the resolution was 47 pages long, and I had read every page twice before the debate even opened, because I had received a draft copy 11 days earlier through a contact at the logistics station on the council's lower corridor. A Velhari clerk named something unpronounceable to human mouths, who had been quietly feeding me paperwork for 8 months in exchange for a steady supply of ground coffee from Earth, which no other species in the known galaxy had thought to import. The resolution declared that humanity was formally banned from all council stations, all approved transit corridors, all allied territory, and all accredited diplomatic channels, effective immediately upon passage. It cited 17 reasons. The first 3 were about military capacity. The next 6 were about economic expansion. The remaining 8 were listed under the heading of behavioral unpredictability, which was the council's careful way of saying that humans made them uncomfortable in ways they could not fully articulate, and that this had been true since the day we arrived. I did not feel anger reading it. I had expected it. What I had not expected was the speed. They moved 3 weeks ahead of the schedule my contact had predicted, which meant someone in the council's inner chamber had pushed for urgency. I had spent 2 of those 3 missing weeks adjusting plans accordingly. When the final speaker finished and Vasaroth called the vote, I put my pen down. I listened to 18 voices, one for each member species, each casting their agreement in their own language. 18 unanimous votes, not one abstention. I had known the result before it was read, but hearing it spoken aloud in that chamber, beneath those high, arching ceilings made from the mineral glass of 3 different worlds, was something that required a moment of stillness. I gave it that moment. Then I stood, and without a word to the 3 other members of the human delegation sitting beside me, I signaled for them to rise. My aide, a young man named Callum who had been with me for 2 years and had learned not to ask questions until I was ready to answer them, rose immediately. The other 2 followed. We walked out of the gallery in a single, unhurried line while the cheering was still happening. Nobody stopped us. Nobody spoke to us. I do not think anyone in that chamber expected us to leave so quietly. They had prepared for protests, for demands, for the kind of dramatic defiance that many of them had studied in their briefings on human conflict behavior. They had not prepared for 4 humans walking calmly toward the exit, as if they had somewhere more interesting to be. We did. In the corridor outside the main chamber, Callum fell into step beside me. He waited exactly 30 seconds. I had timed his patience once, out of curiosity, before he spoke. "Sir," he said, "what do we do now?" I reached into my jacket and took out the notebook. I tore out the page with the vote time and result and handed it to him. "File that," I said, "and then give me a secure line to Asha on Terrath Station." Callum looked at the page. Then he looked at me. He had the particular expression he always wore when he suspected he was about to understand something large and unsettling. "Now," he said, "she's already waiting. I said. I imagine she has been for about 4 minutes. I was right. By the time Callum had the line open and handed me the earpiece, Asha had already started. The handover protocol is running, she said, without greeting, without preamble. Filtration backup is active. The primary system will show a fault reading to station maintenance in approximately 6 hours. The correction pathway that Velhari technicians know will not work. The correction pathway that works is in the manual I left in the secondary maintenance locker on level 3. And the access code for the locker? I asked. Written on the inside cover of a Terith language translation guide on the shelf above the locker, Asha said. Any human reading it would know immediately. Any Velhari reading it would see a list of irregular verbs. I almost smiled. Good. Get home safely. Already packed, she said. I've been packed for 2 weeks. I handed the earpiece back to Callum. He was looking at me the way people look at a map when they suddenly realize it is much larger than they thought. She was ready, he said. It was not quite a question. Most of them were, I said. We walked to the transit bay. Our shuttle was already prepped. I settled into the seat by the porthole and watched the council's grand station fall away behind us. A vast, gleaming structure that had taken 4 species 3 centuries to build, and that now, by official resolution, no human being was permitted to enter or approach. I looked at it for a long time. Then I opened my notebook to a fresh page and began writing the next set of instructions. Below us, the station's lights glittered in the dark like something that believed itself permanent. I had learned a long time ago that very few things are. The day humanity applied for council membership, I was 26 years old and carrying coffee in a thermal flask I had brought from home because the station's dispensers only offered something that tasted like warm metal and regret. That was 18 months before the ban. I want to be clear about the timeline because the council's version of events, the one written into their official record, implies that humanity arrived with a plan, that every move we made was calculated from the beginning, that we were operating some kind of long strategy from the moment we stepped off our first transit ship on a council territory. That is not what happened. What happened was simpler and in some ways stranger. We arrived, and we were ourselves, and the consequences of that turned out to be more significant than any plan could have produced. I was a junior attaché on the initial delegation, the lowest diplomatic rank with clearance to enter the council chamber, which meant I was mostly there to carry things and take notes and stay out of the way of people with more seniority. Our lead diplomat was a woman named Helen Cross, who had spent 30 years negotiating mineral rights disputes between Earth's northern and southern extraction territories, and who treated the Galactic Council with the same calm, steady attention she gave to everything, as a problem that had a solution, and that the solution would be found if you paid close enough attention to what people actually needed rather than what they said they wanted. Helen was the one who accepted the council's original offer without visible reaction. The offer was provisional observer status, 1 non-voting seat in the gallery above the main chamber, no territorial rights, no security guarantees, no trade agreements, no formal diplomatic channels. 1 human representative permitted on council stations at a time, with a 30-day renewable access permit that required 3 species approval to extend. In our post, Relay Station 19, I remember the moment the council's housing coordinator showed us the assignment on a map. Relay Station 19 was a small, half-functional logistics node sitting at the outermost edge of the council's approved corridor network, a place that existed mainly to route cargo between 4 different shipping lanes that each belonged to a different species who barely acknowledged one another's existence. The station had been built by the Terith approximately 90 years earlier and had been in a state of gradual, underfunded decline ever since. The life support systems worked. Most of the time, the docking clamps required manual assistance. The translation matrix was 3 generations out of date, which meant it handled about 60% of known council languages and guessed at the rest. They gave it to us because they thought it was nothing. Because the one thing the council had agreed on before we arrived was that humanity should be contained, should be watched, should be given just enough access to keep us cooperative and not enough to become significant. Helen looked at the map for a long moment. Then she said, "That will do nicely." and signed the paperwork. I thought she was being diplomatic. It took me 4 months to understand she was being precise. We moved on to Relay Station 19 with a delegation of 12. For diplomats, 3 technicians, 2 medical staff, 1 legal analyst, 1 communication specialist, and me. The station had a permanent population of about 340, mostly cargo workers, maintenance crews, and a handful of traders who used the station as a stopping point between longer routes. They were 8 different species, none of whom had ever spent significant time around humans before, and most of whom regarded us with a particular brand of polite indifference that professionals show to people they do not expect to see again. Within 2 weeks, our lead technician, a man named Peter who had the ability to fix almost anything mechanical and the social instinct of someone who had grown up working in crowded spaces, had become a regular fixture in the station's maintenance bay. He was not there officially. He had simply started showing up when the bay crew were struggling with a recurring fault in the secondary pressure regulators, had watched for a day, and had then quietly suggested a fix. It worked. They let him come back the next day. Within 6 weeks, our medical officer had set up an informal clinic in one of the station's and used storage bays. It was not authorized. It was not part of any agreement. She had simply noticed that 3 of the station's cargo workers were showing symptoms she recognized. A nutritional deficiency common when being spent too long on processed rations without the specific mineral compounds their biology required, and she had the supplements in the medical kit she had packed from Earth. She gave them to the workers. The workers told their colleagues. By the end of the month, there was a steady, quiet line of people who came to see her for things the station's under-resourced medical bay did not stock. I had been assigned the task of making contact with the 3 major trading firms that used Relay Station 19 as a waypoint. I was supposed to do this formally through the Council's official diplomatic communication protocol, which required advance notice of meetings, approval from the relevant species Council liaison, and written agendas filed no fewer than 72 hours ahead of any scheduled interaction. I did it by walking down to the docking level and talking to people. The first trader I met was a Terith cargo master named something I could not pronounce, whose ship had been docked for 6 days waiting for a parts delivery that had been delayed at the upstream station. We talked, I listened, and I learned 3 things. First, that parts delays of this kind happen at least twice a month and have been happening for years. Second, that the upstream station's parts coordinator was a Velhari official who had been in the role too long, was largely indifferent to complaints from smaller operators, and responded only when specific senior council members applied pressure. Third, that the Terith cargo master had a cousin at the upstream station who was in the maintenance division and who could, in theory, flag the delayed parts as a station safety concern rather than a routine delivery, which would move them to a different processing queue and cut the delay from 6 days to 2. I knew none of this was my business. My official role was to observe council proceedings and file diplomatic reports. But I also knew that this Terith cargo master had a cargo hold full of medical filtration membranes that were supposed to be at a distribution center in the council's 3rd corridor 3 days ago, and that the distribution center served a population that needed them. I asked if I could make a call for him. He looked at me as if he was not sure whether to be suspicious or amused. I told him I would need to borrow his communications channel and that the call would be in Terith, which I had been studying for 4 months and could manage at a basic level. He let me make the call. The parts arrived in 31 hours. The cargo master shook. It was the Terith gesture for gratitude, and told the next 6 people he spoke to about the human on 19 who had sorted the parts delay. I did not plan what happened after that. I simply kept talking to people and kept listening and kept noticing things that could be made a little better with a small amount of attention and the willingness to make a call or write a note or sit with someone for an hour and understand what they actually needed. Helen never told us to do this. She never needed to. She had simply selected 12 people who already thought this way and put them in a place where thinking that way turned out to matter enormously. By the time 3 months had passed, the human delegation on Relay Station 19 knew the name of every regular cargo operator who passed through the station, the typical schedule of every supply route in the outer corridor network, the maintenance status of the 4 closest council-operated way stations, and the personal relationships between approximately 40% of the logistics professionals who kept the council's outer edge functioning. We were not supposed to matter. We were the provisional observers. We were the species they had filed in the least important station in the network to keep us quiet and distant. But humans, as it turned out, do not stay distant. It is not strategy. It is not ambition, at least not the kind the council feared. It is something older and more ordinary than that. The simple, persistent tendency to notice the person in front of you, to learn their name, to understand their problem, and to help if you can. We do it without thinking. We do it the way other beings breathe. The council had read every report ever written on human military history, our industrial capacity, our rate of technological advancement, our conflict behavior. They had built entire risk models around what humanity might do if given power. They had not built a single model around what humanity does when given a storage locker and a coffee flask and left to get on with things. That was their first error. It was not their last. By the time we had been at Relay Station 19 for a year, the picture was something I could only see fully when I stepped back and looked at it from a distance. I did that one evening in the station's small observation bay, a glass-paneled room at the top of the station's main hub that nobody seemed to use very often because the view was mostly of cargo ships and maintenance drones rather than anything scenic. I sat there with my notebook and I wrote down what I could see. Peter knew every maintenance crew on the station and 4 others within 2 relay stops. He had trained 3 of them in a repair technique for pressure regulators that had since reduced the failure rate in those systems by more than 40% across the corridor. The crews called them by a word in their languages that translated roughly to the one who shows. Our medical officer had treated over 200 patients from 7 species. She had trained 2 of the station's existing medical staff in 3 new procedures. She had established an informal emergency contact system between medical staff at 6 stations across the outer network, which meant that for the first time, a medical crisis at one station could get information and advice from a qualified practitioner at another within minutes. Our communications specialist had built a network of informal contacts among station administrators, logistics coordinators, and cargo brokers across 23 stations. It was not an official network. It had no name. It ran on personal trust and shared information and the occasional favor, and had already moved 3 stalled supply situations and 1 emergency medical shipment to resolution faster than any official channel would have managed. I had personally spoken to representatives of 11 species and had become, in at least 2 documented cases, the first human being those representatives had ever had an extended conversation with. Neither of them had said anything alarming afterward. One of them had said, with what I took to be genuine surprise, that I was not what he had expected. I had asked what he had expected. He had thought for a long moment, and then said he was not entirely sure, but something more frightening. We had been given the least significant posting in the council's network. We had turned it into a knot in a web that stretched across the outer corridor with threads too small to see individually, but collectively holding more weight than anyone looking at the map would have guessed. And we had never told anyone, not because we were hiding it, but because none of it felt like something that needed to be announced. It just felt like the ordinary work of paying attention. The council made rules about what humans were and were not allowed to do in the official framework. We had read every rule carefully. We had not broken a single one. We had simply built everything in the spaces the rules did not cover, because those spaces turn out to be very large, and we are very good at finding them. I closed my notebook that evening and sat for a while in the dark of the observation bay, watching a Terrath cargo hauler maneuver toward the docking clamp that Peter had personally serviced the week before, guided by a docking technician who knew exactly which channel to use to reach a human if anything went wrong in the night. They gave us nothing and called it mercy. We built everything from it anyway and never told them what we had. The week after the ban, the calls started coming in, not to Earth's official diplomatic line. That line had been formally closed by the Council under the terms of 7 Omega, because official communication channels were classified as a form of diplomatic access, and all human diplomatic access had been revoked. The Council had been very thorough about that. They had spent considerable time drawing lines around every category of formal human presence and sealing each one shut. They had not drawn a line around personal calls. The first came from a mid-level logistics coordinator at the Terrathway station called Depot 7, a being whose name my translation ship rendered as something like Verthale, and who had worked with one of our people, a man named George, on several supply routing adjustments over the past year. Verthale was not calling for political reasons. Verthale was calling because a shipment of cold storage medical goods had been sitting in Depot 7's secondary bay for 4 days because the routing algorithm had generated an error that George's team had been managing manually until the ban came through and George went home. The algorithm error was not complicated, but the standard fix required access to a legacy interface in the routing system, and the only non-human who understood the legacy interface had left with George. Verthale needed a solution. I was back on Earth by then, in my apartment in the North Settlement District with its view of the old bridge and the gray morning light that always made the city look like a photograph of itself. I was on my third coffee of the day and working through the first of what would become a very long list of incoming matters. I listened to Verthale's problem, asked 3 questions, and told him to open the routing system's maintenance log and look for a file called Override Delta 7. It will not be in the primary menu, I said. It is 2 levels down under Legacy Tools in a folder called Administrative Utilities that has not been updated since the system was installed. There was a pause. How do you know this? Verthale asked. Because George put it there 6 months ago, I said, after the 3rd time the algorithm generated that error. He told me about it as a precaution. Another pause. Then, it is here. The instructions are inside the file, I said. They are in Terith and Velhari, because George translated them both. Follow them in order, and the shipment will route within 2 hours. Bertail Sankme. I wrote the call on my log and moved to the next one. There were 16 more that day, 11 the day after. By the end of the 2nd week, I had a team of 7 former delegation staff working from homes and offices across Earth, fielding calls and messages from 16 different species across 31 stations. We were not doing anything official. We were not representing Earth in any diplomatic capacity. We were just helping, the way we always had. The Council's ban applied to human presence in Council territory. It applied to official diplomatic channels and trade agreements and accredited personnel. It did not apply to a woman on Earth answering a phone call from a panic station administrator who could not get his ventilation system to recalibrate. That woman was Nina, one of our former station engineers, and she had the ventilation system's diagnostic manual memorized because she had written half of it herself during her 18 months at Relay Station 19. She talked the station's maintenance team through the recalibration in 40 minutes. They thanked her. She said it was no trouble. She hung up and went back to her tea. I kept a list. By the end of the 3rd week, I had documented 47 separate instances of Council territory systems or processes that had encountered significant difficulty. Not catastrophic failure, not yet, but the kind of persistent, grinding difficulty that slows everything down and wears at the people responsible for keeping things running. The Council had banned a threat. They had been thinking about soldiers and warships and economic dominance and the frightening human capacity for conflict. They had been thinking about power in the ways that large, old civilizations think about power, as something held at the top, wielded from above, imposed through force or law or the threat of either. They had not thought about Asha. Asha was the reason I had made that call at 14:09, 2 minutes after the vote. She was not a diplomat or a technician or an official of any kind. She was a logistics coordinator on Terra Station who had come there 4 years earlier with a temporary work permit and had stayed because the work needed doing and she was good at it. She had no grand role in the human delegation's activities. She was not in any of our strategy documents. She had simply been herself, attentive, patient, quietly capable, for 4 years in a place that needed those qualities, and in that time she had learned the station's systems the way you learn a language you use every day. Not from textbooks, but from living inside it. The Terra Station's water filtration system was the most critical piece of infrastructure on the station for a population of over 4,000. It was also, as it happened, a hybrid design that combined Velhari engineering with a Terath-manufactured secondary circuit that had been installed during a refurbishment 12 years earlier. The problem with hybrid systems is that they work beautifully when everyone who needs to service them understands both halves equally well. The problem at Terra Station was that the Velhari engineers who had originally installed the primary system had been replaced 3 times in 12 years, and institutional knowledge has a way of going out the door with people. The current Velhari maintenance team understood the primary system. They did not understand a secondary circuit because they had never been trained on it, and the documentation was in an older dialect of Terath that none of them read. Asha understood both halves. She had made it her business to over 4 years of working on that station. She had sat with old maintenance logs and cross-referenced systems manuals and had asked questions of the oldest Terath crew member on the station until she could trace every pipe and valve and sensor reading in both systems from memory. When I sent her the message of 1409, she had already pulled her bags from under her bunk and was sitting on the edge of her bed, waiting. She had known this was coming. We had discussed it 3 weeks earlier when the draft resolution reached me through my contact, and she had immediately understood what it meant and what would need to happen. She spent the next 4 hours before her departure creating a complete maintenance guide for the secondary filtration circuit, not a technical document, because the Velhari engineers already had those. She wrote a guide in plain language, with diagrams she drew by hand, explaining the relationship between the 2 halves of the system in terms that anyone with basic engineering knowledge could follow. She wrote it in 3 languages. She put in a maintenance locker on level 3, as she had told me, with the access code hidden exactly where she said. Then she walked off Terrace Station, boarded a transit ship, and came home. 6 hours after she left, the Velhari maintenance team encountered a fault in the filtration system's secondary circuit. It was not a catastrophic fault. It was the kind of fault that the secondary circuit produced approximately every 4 months, and that Asha had always resolved within 2 hours. Without Asha, the team ran the standard Velhari diagnostic protocol, which was designed for the primary system and did not map correctly onto the secondary circuit. The diagnostic told them the fault was in a sensor cluster. They replaced the sensor cluster. The fault continued. They called their engineering department. The engineering department sent 2 specialists the following morning. The specialists ran the same diagnostic. They also replaced a pressure valve on the primary side, which was not related to the problem. The fault continued. On the 3rd day, a Terath Station administrator named Volcheth sent a message to Earth. It was addressed to me personally because Volcheth had my contact information from a supply routing matter we had resolved together 8 months earlier and had not had reason to delete it. I passed the message to Nina, who contacted Asha, who spent 20 minutes on an audio call with the Velhari maintenance lead walking him through the exact location of the fault and the exact sequence of steps required to correct it. She was patient and clear and did not once mention that she had left a written guide to this precise problem in the maintenance locker on level 3 because she thought it would be more useful to the Velhari lead if he understood the solution rather than just executed the steps from a document. The fault was resolved in 35 minutes. Volcheth sent me a second message. It said only, "The Human Council does not seem to understand what it has done." I wrote back, "I know. The Council did not release a public statement about the supply disruptions. They did not release a statement about the filtration issue at Terath Station or the routing problems at Depot 7 or the 11 other documented instances of system difficulty in the first 3 weeks. The Council was very practiced at managing information, and the last thing the governing body of an 18-species interstellar alliance needed was for its member populations to understand that the species they had just unanimously banned was, in some places and in some ways, holding things together. But private statements were a different matter. By the end of the 4th week, I had received 3 separate back-channel communications from Council-adjacent parties. Not from member species governments. From individuals within those governments who had the authority to make quiet contact without it appearing in any official record. The first was from a Terath trade minister who wanted to discuss the practical implications of the resolution on outer corridor logistics. I agreed to speak with him and said I was happy to discuss practical implications at any time. I did not remind him that under the terms of 7 Omega, he was technically not supposed to be in communication with me. He did not mention it either. The second was from a Velhari council liaison who wanted to know if the human delegation had any outstanding technical documentation related to systems managed by human personnel on council stations. I referred him to Helen, who told him that all human personnel had followed the terms of the resolution and departed council territory in an orderly fashion, and that any documentation they had produced during their time at their respective postings was the property of those stations and should be retrievable through standard administrative channels. It was in the maintenance locker on level 3. Helen knew that. I knew that. The Velhari liaison eventually would figure it out. The third back-channel communication was the most interesting. It came from a species called the Corvin, a quiet, careful people who had been members of the Galactic Council for 400 years without ever being among its most prominent voices. The Corvin had voted for 7 Omega along with everyone else. But their back-channel message was not from a trade minister or a council liaison. It was from a senior council member herself, a woman, or the Corvin equivalent, named El Verith, who is the Corvin's permanent representative to the council chamber. Her message was 7 words long. We would like to understand your next step. I read it 4 times. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I wrote back 6 words. Come to Earth. We will talk. She came. I met El Verith in a small conference room in Earth's diplomatic center in the north quarter of the central settlement, a modest building that the Earth Council used for lower priority meetings because the grander hall was being repainted and nobody had thought to schedule around it. El Verith arrived with 1 aide and no cameras. She was small by the standards of the Council's dominant species, and she moved carefully with the deliberate attention of a being who had spent centuries learning how to read rooms. She looked at me across the table for a long time before she spoke. When she did, she skipped every formal greeting protocol entirely. The resolution was supported unanimously, she said, including by us. I know, I said. I want you to understand that our support was not without reservation. I assumed, I said. She was quiet for a moment. The Velhari led the motion. They have led most motions of this kind for the past 2 centuries. When Vasaroth calls something a matter of civilizational self-preservation, the chamber listens. It is difficult to be the single dissenting voice against something framed that way. I nodded. I understood the mechanics of council politics well enough. When the most powerful voice in the room calls a thing necessary, the cost of disagreement is high. I am not here to apologize, El Verith said. I did not expect you to be, I said. I am here because the Corvin have been part of this council for 400 years, she said. And in that time, we have watched many things be removed from the network because someone powerful decided they were a risk. And in every case, the removal caused damage that took longer to repair than anyone had predicted. She paused. We have been paying attention to what is happening in the outer corridors. I know, I said again. It has been 4 weeks, she said. The scale of the disruption in the outer corridor is not yet visible to the full council. But it will be. Yes, I said. It will. She looked at me with those careful, ancient eyes. You do not seem concerned. I am very concerned, I said honestly. People in the outer corridors depend on those systems. Every day a filtration unit is not running correctly or a medical shipment is sitting in a stalled routing queue. Real harm builds up. That concerns me a great deal. Then why? She paused, and I could see her choosing her next words carefully. Why am I not in the council chamber demanding reinstatement? I said. Yes. I leaned back in my chair. Because the council passed a unanimous resolution. I cannot undo that with a demand. No amount of diplomatic pressure from Earth reverses 18 unanimous votes. The only thing that reverses a unanimous vote is if the people who cast it come to understand that the vote created a problem they did not intend. I picked up my coffee cup. It was from Earth, my own flask, the same kind I've been carrying since the beginning. I'm giving them time to understand that. El Verith studied me. And in the meantime, your people continue to help. From Earth. Through personal channels. We help where we can, I said. That is, she stopped. Unexpected, I offered. I was going to say difficult to counter, she said quietly. I smiled at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was true. and she had said it honestly. They thought they were removing a threat. They had actually removed the person holding the ceiling up. And now the ceiling was showing the first cracks. And the people who lived below it were starting to look up with expressions that were less like triumph and more like concern. We had not planned this. We did not engineer it. We had simply been ourselves in the places we had been given for long enough that being ourselves had become load-bearing. And now the weight was showing. The emergency session request came 7 weeks after the ban. It was formally issued by the Velhari delegation, Vasaratha's office, which told me the Velhari were moving first because they were the ones most exposed. The outer corridor logistics network that had developed over the past 18 months touched Velhari supply lines at 19 different points. Of the 47 documented disruption incidents in my first week log, 14 had directly affected Velhari managed systems or Velhari population service routes. Vasarath had called the resolution a matter of civilizational self-preservation. What she was finding was that civilization, preserved from humans, was functioning less smoothly than it had before. I flew to the council station with Callum and one other aide, a woman named Paula, who was our legal analyst and who had the ability to read complicated documents at remarkable speed and retain every clause with perfect accuracy. I had asked her to reread 3 specific texts on the flight over. The original Provisional Observer Agreement that humanity had signed 18 months ago, the full text of Resolution 7 Omega, and the Council's own Charter of Membership Governance, which was a document 400 years old and 1,200 pages long, and which I had personally read twice in the preceding 2 months. We arrived without announcement. I had informed the Council's session coordinator that the human delegation would attend, as required by the session notice. I had not told anyone how many of us were coming or who. Several of the Council's member delegations seemed to expect a larger group, perhaps a show of numbers, a demonstration of weight. What they got was 3 humans, 2 of whom sat quietly in the chairs assigned to the Human Observer section while I took my place at the floor-level addressing position. The chamber looked the same as it always did. The same high ceilings, the same golden clock above the podium, the same 18 posts arranged in a wide arc that gave every species equal sight lines to the speaker. Vasarath was at the Velhari post. Elvareth was at the Corvin post. The other 16 member species were all present. Vasarath opened the session. She did it formally, with full protocol, which told me she was treating this as a standard session rather than an emergency, a decision meant to signal that the Council was in control of the situation. She reviewed the context, Resolution 7 Omega, its unanimous passage 7 weeks ago, and the transitional period of adjustment that the Council had been monitoring in the outer corridor network. Transitional period of adjustment. I wrote that phrase in my notebook. She then outlined the proposal. Humanity would be permitted to return to Council territory under a revised observer framework. This framework would include a licensed contractor status for human personnel, with mandatory registration of all human individuals working on Council stations, activity caps limiting the scope of human involvement in any single station's operations to no more than 15% of any critical systems management, and an ongoing monitoring committee, chaired by the Velhari, with authority to review and revoke individual human access permits. She presented this for 11 minutes. I listened to all of it. I did not write anything after the first 2 lines. When she finished, the chair opened the floor for response. I stood. Ambassador Cole, the chair said. Thank you, I said. I did not thank Vasarath. I thanked the chair because the chair had given me the floor, and that was the correct person to thank. I have one question, I said, before I respond to the proposal. I felt the attention in the room sharpen. One question was not what they had prepared for. The question is this, I said. Resolution 7 Omega was passed under the Council's authority to regulate observer status and access within Council territory. I have read the resolution carefully, and I have also read the Council Charter under which that authority is defined. I paused. Under Chapter 12, Article 4 of the Charter, which has been in continuous effect for 380 years, the Council's authority to restrict observer movement applies only to observers who have formally entered the accession process. The room was very quiet. Humanity's observer status was granted under the Provisional Observer Framework, I said, not under the accession framework. Those are two different classifications under Chapter 12. The Provisional Framework has its own governing rules, and those rules are in the original Observer Agreement that your predecessor body signed with Earth's first delegation 18 months ago. I opened my folder. I have that agreement here. I brought 3 copies. I gave one to the chair, one to the council's legal secretary, who was seated off to the side and had gone very still, and kept one for myself. Under Article 7 of that agreement, I said, any unilateral restriction on the movement or activities of a provisional observer issued without the observer's consent and without a formal mediation process, which Resolution 7 Omega was, since Earth was neither consulted nor invited to a mediation, constitutes a material breach of the agreement. I turned a page. Article 9 specifies the consequence of a material breach. A provisional observer who has experienced a material breach of their agreement is entitled to full withdrawal from the provisional framework, which immediately and automatically releases that observer from all treaty obligations they have assumed as a condition of observer status. I looked up. Earth currently honors 43 treaty obligations as a condition of our provisional observer status. I said, they include trade route access agreements, non-interference commitments in 4 border systems, and a mutual defense information sharing protocol that covers 17 council members. I closed the folder. I want to be very clear. I am not threatening to invoke Article 9. I am reading the Charter to you, as it is written, so that the Council has full information before deciding how to respond to the current situation. I sat down. The silence lasted for a long time. It was not the silence of a room that has nothing to say. It was the silence of a room that has a great deal to say and is very carefully deciding which of those things it is safe to say out loud. Vasaroth spoke first. Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. The Council's legal team will need to review the agreement, she said. Of course, I said. I brought copies. Paula leaned toward me and said, very quietly, that was the whole plan, wasn't it? Just reading. Just reading, I said. The document was always there. They filed it themselves. Elvereth, at the Corvin Post, was not looking at Vasaroth. She was looking at me. I could not read her expression with certainty, but if I had to name it, I would have called it recognition. The look of a being who has seen something move the way they expected it to move and is noting that they were right. The Council's legal secretary requested a recess of 2 hours. It was granted. I spent the recess in a small anteroom with Callum and Paula, drinking tea from the flask I had brought from home. Callum spent most of the recess not speaking, which meant he was thinking hard. Paula spent it reading. She had her own copy of the Charter and was working through it at the speed she always worked, marking pages with small folded corners. They cannot invoke the breach claim against us, she said at one point. Article 9 is unambiguous. If they try to argue the resolution was valid, they have to explain why they bypassed the mediation requirement. If they try to argue the mediation requirement doesn't apply to provisional observers, they undermine their own authority to have passed the resolution in the first place, because that authority also derives from the provisional framework. I know, I said. You knew this before we came, she said. It was not a question. I knew it before the vote, I said. I found the clause 11 days before the session, when my contacts sent me the draft. Paula was quiet for a moment. And you waited. I waited, I said, because a legal argument presented before a vote is a negotiating tactic. The same argument presented after 7 weeks of outer corridor disruptions, in a chamber full of delegations who are beginning to understand the practical consequences of the resolution. That is something else. She thought about that. Leverage, she said. Context, I said. There's a difference. I did not create the problem in the outer corridors to gain leverage. The problem created itself because of what the ban removed. I just gave it enough time to become visible. The recess ended. We returned to the floor. The Council's legal secretary confirmed, in carefully neutral language, that the observer agreement predated the Council's resolution and that several clauses in the agreement did appear to be in potential tension with the resolution as passed. She recommended that the council consider a voluntary suspension of the resolution pending formal review. Vasaroth moved for the suspension. The vote was 16 in favor, 2 abstentions. Nobody voted against. The resolution that had passed unanimously 7 weeks ago was suspended by the end of the afternoon session. I read the clause to the end, folded the document the way my grandfather taught me to fold paper, careful, deliberate, and waited. The suspension was the beginning, not the end. But then, it always was. The new treaty took 4 months to negotiate. I was at the table for most of it, with Helen leading and Paula beside her, and a rotating cast of specialists who flew in from Earth whenever the discussion moved into territory that required detailed knowledge. Systems engineers, medical coordinators, logistics specialists, people who had spent years in the places the council was only now beginning to understand properly. The treaty was not a victory document. I want to be clear about that. It was not designed to be. Helen had been in this business long enough to know that agreements built on one side's triumph tend to be the kind of agreements that get relitigated 3 years later, when the defeated party has rebuilt enough confidence to try again. What we built instead was a framework of mutual dependency, a formal, documented acknowledgement of the ways in which the Council's outer network and Earth's community of skilled professionals had, over the past 18 months, become genuinely useful to one another. Not dependent in the way that creates vulnerability, dependent in the way that creates investment. The kind of relationship where both parties have reason to keep things working because things working benefits them both. The human observer status was upgraded, not to full membership. That process would take longer and was a separate conversation, but to a recognized associate partner status with voting rights on matters affecting the Outer Corridor network, guaranteed access permits for human personnel working in agreed roles, and a formal channel for technical coordination that did not require 3 species approval to use. Earth agreed, in turn, to a set of information-sharing commitments that were genuinely useful to the Council. Documentation of systems knowledge held by human personnel, training programs to transfer that knowledge to Council species technicians, and a joint review process for Outer Corridor infrastructure that would, over time, reduce the kind of single point of failure situations that Asha's departure had created. We wrote every clause. Helen was careful about the language, as she always was. She had a principle she had carried since her days in Earth's extraction territory disputes. The strongest agreement is one where the other party walks away believing they got something real. We made sure the Council got something real. We also made sure Earth got something real. And we made sure the Outer Corridors got something real because they were the ones who had been living in the space between the politics, holding things together with personal relationships and handwritten maintenance guides left in number lockers. On the day the treaty was signed, I was in the Council chamber again, not in the observer gallery, but on the floor at the table that had been set up in the center of the arc for the signing ceremony. It was the first time a human had sat at the floor-level table as a party to a Council agreement rather than as a visitor watching from above. The signing took about 20 minutes. It was dignified and formal and involved a great deal of precise protocol. When it was done, Vasaroth and I both touched our marks to the document. Earth's was a handwritten signature because humans have done it that way for a very long time and there is no good reason to stop, and the chair declared the agreement in effect. Afterward, during the reception in the corridor outside the chamber, Vasaroth approached me. She moved carefully, the way she always did, with the deliberate precision of a species that had learned long ago that deliberateness is a form of strength. She asked if she could speak with me privately. We stepped away from a main gathering, into an alcove near one of the large windows that looked out over the station's docking ring. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the window rather than at me. When she spoke, her translator chip gave her words a flat, even tone, but the pauses between them were hers. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Please," I said. "When did your people begin preparing?" she asked. "For the ban. When did you start planning what you would do?" I thought about the question. It deserved an honest answer, and I gave it one. "We did not prepare for the ban," I said. "Not as a plan. We did not know the ban was coming until 11 days before the vote, and by then most of what mattered was already in place." She looked at me then. "The network in the outer corridors," she said. "The relationships. The knowledge stored in systems your people had worked on for 18 months. That was not preparation for the ban, I said. That was just what we were doing. She was very still for a moment. The message you sent, she said, at 14:09, 2 minutes after the vote. I had wondered if she knew about that. It did not surprise me that she did. That was to a logistics coordinator named Asha, I said. On Terrath Station. She had already begun the handover protocol before you called, Vasaroth said. We reviewed the station's administrative logs during the treaty process. The handover file was time-stamped at 14:04. Yes, I said. She had been ready for 2 weeks. She was not part of your delegation, Vasaroth said. No, I said. She was just someone who worked there, someone who paid attention and understood what was around her and cared about whether it kept working. I paused. There are a lot of people like her. Vasaroth looked at me. The expression on her face was not what I expected. It was not anger, and it was not calculation. It was something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. We modeled your military capacity, she said, your economic trajectory, your rate of technological advancement. She paused. We did not model this. I know, I said. We looked for power, she said, in the places where we expected to find it. Power is not usually where people expect to find it, I said. She was silent for a long moment. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for, the one that had been behind every exchange we had since the vote. The question that was really the entire shape of the past 7 weeks distilled into a single sentence. You were never afraid, were you? She said. It came out as a statement, not a question, because she had been watching me long enough to believe she already knew the answer. I looked at her, and I told her the truth. We were afraid all the time, I said. From the first day on Relay Station 19, from the moment we understood how exposed we were, how little protection we had, how completely the outcome of everything depended on things we could not fully control. I thought about Helen signing the Provisional Observer Agreement without visible reaction, about Peter showing up in the maintenance bay without being asked, about Asha sitting on the edge of her bunk with her bags packed, waiting for a message she had known would come. We were afraid every day. We just never let it stop us. Vasaroth looked at me for a long time. Then she looked away, back toward the window and the docking ring and the station that her species had helped build 600 years ago. That, she said quietly, is the part we did not model either. I did not have an answer for that. I was not sure one was needed. Across the reception room, I could see Callum talking to one of the Terrath trade delegates, the two of them deep in some discussion, gesturing at something on Callum's data tablet. Nearby, Paula was in conversation with the Corvin legal secretary, both of them with documents open and the particular focused energy of people who have found someone else who shares their very specific interest. At the far end of the corridor, Helen was speaking with a Velhari trade minister and a Corvin council member simultaneously, her attention moving between them with the calm, even distribution of someone who had been doing this for 30 years. We had been banned, formally, unanimously, with great ceremony and considerable self-congratulation. It had been announced as a matter of civilizational self-preservation. And we had been so thoroughly woven into things by then, not through force, not through strategy, but through the simple daily act of showing up and paying attention and helping where help was needed, that the ban had been irrelevant from the moment it passed. You cannot remove people by passing a resolution against them when those people are already part of how things work. You cannot cut someone out of a system when the cut damages the system more than their presence ever did. You cannot preserve your civilization from people who have, quietly and without announcement, become part of what keeps your civilization running. The council had made their decision at 14:07. By 14:09, Asha had started the handover. By 14:04, actually, she already started. She had not needed the message. She had simply needed to know that we were all still moving in the same direction, and she had already known that. The ban lasted 7 weeks. The treaty we built after will last much longer. Not because Earth forced it, but because the outer corridors needed it, and the people of the outer corridors of every species, every post, every cargo route and maintenance bay and medical station had already shown through 7 weeks of phone calls and quiet conversations and one handwritten maintenance guide in a numbered locker that the alternative was something nobody actually wanted. I finished my tea. I looked out at the station. I thought about my grandfather, who had taught me to fold paper carefully. Not because folded paper is powerful, but because the habit of care applied to small things has a way of maturing in large ones. I thought about a storage locker on Relay Station 19 and a broken pressure regulator and a Tariff cargo master who let a young human with a basic command of his language make one phone call. I thought about all the small things we had done in all the small spaces between the rules over 18 months on a station that was supposed to mean nothing, and how those small things had turned out to be the only things that mattered. The council had banned humans. It had already been too late. It had been too late from the first cup of coffee.